Good. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome again to this course on new trends on global trade governance, and welcome to our second interview to an expert. Welcome to our second EUKIT talk, which will be dealing with one of the most salient topics in the recent years in global trade governance, which is the Brexit, the withdrawal of the UK from the EU integration process, and the negotiations and the agreement on trade issues and economic issues of these two key important actors in global trade and main actors in the European Union. To talk about all these issues that drove us here today, we have with us Mr. Paul Clark, Director of Trade and Investment of the Trade and Investment Department of the British Consulate-General here in Barcelona, and we welcome you, Paul, for joining us today. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. You are becoming a recurrent key speaker in our school, which is great. It's an honor, and we thank you for accepting to be with us again and adapting adjusting your agenda to do it today. So thank you very, very much.
No, it's great. It's great to have the opportunity. I think it's the maybe sixth time I've spoken since the referendum. And it's always great. As you know, I did my master's at Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, taught out of Pompeu Fabra. So it's always brilliant to be able to collaborate with you.
Thank you very much. We have tons of things to discuss. As you just put it, it's the sixth time you visit ESCI-UPF to talk about the Brexit. Unfortunately, it's a pity that this time it must be done online. Hopefully next time you will join us offline. I said we have tons of things to discuss with you, and I've considered a couple of very general questions just to warm up and introduce the broader topics, and then, if you don't mind, we will leave the floor to our students that kindly join this session. Some of them are enrolled in this course, others just are here because of their interest and taste for the topics. So after these very brief and general questions, we will leave the floor to the audience. So this is how it we considered the session to unfold, to unpack, and we're considering to be with you around 75-80 minutes, depending on the questions we gather. So, Paul, tell us, what are the main features, the main characteristics of this brand new trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU? We have heard about it, talking about it for the last 4 years, but what was decided? What is in the new trade and cooperation agreement?
Yeah, no, as you say, Joan, it's over 4 years since the referendum, and having worked kind of around these issues, it feels even longer than that. it feels like the negotiations lasted a long time. Worth remembering that the first 3 years after the referendum were all to do with the withdrawal agreement and the terms of the UK leaving the EU, and then the recent negotiation last year was about the future relationship. And it was a negotiation that lasted around, it started in, I think, March last year. It lasted around 300 days. From the UK side, we had around 450 people who actually negotiated for the UK side. Huge effort from both sides, and I don't know the numbers for the European Commission who were representing the EU, probably just as many. And it was a tough negotiation, and we can go into that in more detail later. But eventually we reached an agreement on the 24th of December on Christmas Eve, so an early Christmas present. And it's a trade and cooperation agreement that was reached. So note that it's not just an FTA, it's a TCA, trade and cooperation agreement, because there's three pillars to it, and the free trade agreement is only one aspect of it. There's also a pillar around cooperation, around law enforcement, so how we kind of cooperate and exchange information about criminals, things like this. There's a third pillar around governance, so how the deal is actually policed and making sure both sides kind of play by the rules of the agreement. But for most of this discussion today, I'll concentrate on the first pillar, which is the free trade agreement, because, as you said, so my job is Director of Trade and Investment here in the Department for International Trade, our trade ministry's representation in Barcelona. So it's the area that I kind of spend most of my time thinking about. So I'll major on that today. I mean, the principal features of the free trade agreement are, on the goods side, it creates a 100% liberalisation of tariffs, which is the first time the EU has ever struck a deal that does this. So it's the most ambitious deal ever in terms of tariff liberalisation. So 100% of goods that are made in the UK can go to the EU tariff free, and vice versa. There's also no quotas, so there's no limit to how many goods you can export tariff free. And obviously this is a huge result for businesses, not just businesses but consumers. So I think the UK trades with the EU, I think £430 billion worth of goods a year. So it's huge. It's around, the EU's roughly accounts for half of the UK's trade. And the EU actually exports a lot more to the UK than the UK does to the EU. So this is also an extremely important deal for both sides. Not just for businesses who export, also consumers. So, you know, people in the UK who are buying cava from Catalonia, for example, or people who are buying, I don't know, gin from here, from the UK. We don't only trade alcohol. There's more things than that. But there's a couple of examples that come to my head during lockdown. These are more important products, maybe.
I was sorry for interrupting you, Paul. I was thinking on a Stilton cheese instead of gin, but I agree.
Yeah, that's a good one too. So it's great for consumers who will continue to have lower prices than would have otherwise been the case. It's good for exporters and businesses. So that's good on the good side. And then on the services side, it also provides market access for service providers, for investment, for would-be investors. There is, it's based on the very best precedent of the EU trade deals with the other countries. So EU-Japan is a lot of the precedent for this one comes from EU-Japan. There's something called the most favoured nation clause in it on services, which means that if either side does an even better deal on services with another country, then we have to kind of improve this one to make it as good as the others. In other words, the EU and the UK cannot do a better services deal with another country than this one. And I mean, services, so where it comes to goods, obviously that's kind of physical things across the border and they're dealt with at the border. Services is more about regulations, and so it kind of differs by sectors, and we can maybe go into more of that later. But they're the kind of main features on the goods side, the services side. And also on mobility, which is important, it creates provisions for people to go to the other, so British people to come, say, here into Barcelona for business meetings, and they can stay for up to 3 months. And likewise for people from here to go over to the UK. So it provides that framework for short-term business travel. They're probably the main things that I would flag. Obviously, we can go into more detail during the rest of the conversation.
Good, thank you very much. Before before moving on, I was thinking something which has brought doubts and quite many, which was quite not clearly understood by many Europeans, many continental Europeans, is the final arrangement that the UK and the EU have agreed on Northern Ireland. We are hearing that the border is no longer between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, that the border is on the sea. Could you please clarify all these terms just to try to get the whole picture of it?
Yeah, I mean, so this was a really important part of the withdrawal agreement, because both sides recognise the importance of avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland. So for people who don't understand UK geography, Northern Ireland is a part of the UK, but it's on the same physical island as the Republic of Ireland, which is a separate country. And so the north being out of the EU and the south being in the EU, that creates a land border. But for political historic reasons, it's absolutely fundamental that there's never a hard border there. There's been decades of what was known as the Troubles and very difficult situation, and so ensuring peace and continuing to abide by the peace process and the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, it's really important that we avoid that hard border. So, I mean, it's extremely complicated, but basically the solution has been that the Northern Ireland has kind of a special status. It's still part of the UK, but it is aligned with EU rules on things like agricultural goods, where health and plant and animal health checks are important. It's a line there. For customs, it has a special customs status where it's part of the UK customs area, but also has a kind of special status and shares EU customs code too. All this is a very complicated solution, but it all means that goods that go from Northern Ireland to Ireland or Ireland to Northern Ireland, even if they are kind of slightly complicated products like animal products, they don't need to have any checks at the border, so that complies with the mandates on both sides, protecting that situation, and also it maintains the kind of the UK market too, and so Northern Ireland obviously continues to be part of the UK, and there's a committee that kind of continues talking about these issues to make sure that going forward, the processes are as streamlined as possible.
Yeah, I was thinking that it seems like the only solution possible to square the circle, right? And it shows how complicated those second phase negotiations were, trying to get a compromise, not only in mere trade issues, which was fairly easy because the UK has been part of the single market for years, so exchanging goods was not that. I mean, agreeing on keeping on exchanging goods was not that difficult in technical issues. So this very particular solution that both negotiating teams reach in regards the Northern Ireland situations, I mean, to my understanding, shows how politically embedded this agreement is, and it brings us back to your first idea, right? It's not only a trade agreement; it's far more than that. It's an agreement that tries to look at the future.
Yeah.
I have more questions for you, Paul. Thanks. I mean, with this idea of mine, could you? I mean, trying to see what's the general picture now. We have focused on Northern Ireland first, but could you please try to describe for us how does the new situation differ from the time back when the UK was a full member of the European Union? What are the main differences?
Yeah. So there's big differences. So this is a really comprehensive trade agreement, but it is still very different from being inside the single market. So when the UK is a member of the EU, I mean, there's certain conditions for being a member of the EU. So, for example, the UK was paying into the EU budget. There was full free movement of people. The UK had to comply with EU regulations as part of the single market. And so, I mean, one of the main objective really for leaving the EU and for why people voted to leave the EU, and then the government kind of took that forward, is to regain sovereignty, which means that the UK has control of its own regulations, its own laws, its own borders, its money. And so the situation in terms of market access is different, even though this is a very comprehensive free trade agreement, best in class, but it's still different from being in the single market. So, for example, on the goods side, there's for example, there's things like rules of origin that apply, which means that you get tariff-free access if the good is British, or the good is from the EU. But imagine if you are in the UK and you actually import the goods in from, say, China, and then you do very little with it, you just then sell that onto the EU. That wouldn't get tariff-free access, because that wouldn't comply with the rules of origin, meaning where the product's actually from. And therefore you would actually have to pay tariffs on those goods. I was speaking to a business in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago who said that they're paying tariffs on the goods they're sending to the UK, because they sell clothes and the fabric comes from Bangladesh or Morocco, and so there are cases where, even though there's the free trade agreement, so for the vast majority of goods, it's free, there's without tariffs. There are cases where tariffs are applicable because of the fact that the goods come from elsewhere. Whereas obviously when you're in the single market, once the goods in the single market, that's you can't. There's no restrictions there. I mentioned when you asked about Ireland, I mentioned about health and plant animal checks, and that's another important kind of difference now compared to before. The UK is now out of what's known as the SPS, which stands for sanitary and phytosanitary. It's all about the health of these products. The UK is out of that area, which means that when goods go from the EU to the UK, or the UK to the EU, and they are, say, I don't know, meat products, they have to go through checks to make sure that they, are not carrying diseases, and they comply with the regulations in the other market. It's not a fully frictionless situation like it was before. The customs processes, by the way, I mean, so it's not just for these animal products. For any goods you trade, there's a difference between tariff-free. There's a difference between no tariffs or zero tariffs. The situation is zero tariffs, which means that when you do the exports, you still have to declare the good and say that you're selling it, or you're exporting it, or you're importing it. It's just the tariff you pay is zero, but there is still paperwork that companies have to fill in, which they wouldn't have had to do within the single market. On the services side, for example, you can see in the trade agreement is the TCA is 1,246 pages long. So I wouldn't read it unless you've got insomnia. But to have for students who are interested, it is worth having just a flick through just to see how it's structured. And you can see towards the end of the document, there's a long annex of what's known as reservations, where countries opt out of certain provisions. So, for example, a Spanish reservation is around, say, pharmacists. And so a UK pharmacist can't set up in Spain unless it meets an economic needs test. So the Spanish authorities can decide whether it actually puts the local producers at an advantage or something like that. So there's plenty of reasons why it's different from before, which comes out of the fact that the UK isn't part of the club anymore. So the UK. So then it's logical that you don't get the full frictionless market access that you would as if you're a member of the club. But I think there's plenty of provisions in the deal that make this, like some of the ones I mentioned before, around goods and services, and even on things like technical barriers to trade and where regulations are different. There's provisions in there to try and foster cooperation and to minimize these frictions going forward. But it's just a different relationship to being in a single market in terms of both the rights that the UK has and that the EU has, and its obligations. So what it has to sign up to, if you see what I mean. Neither side has to align with the other's regulations, but for the same reason, that means that neither side has frictionless access to the other one's market.
I very much like this idea of a non-frictionless agreement, because perhaps for the non-trade experts, the expectation was to come into an arrangement, to come into a solution clearly frictionless, and perhaps this is naturally impossible, right? Just for while listening to you, I was keeping in remembering those images of the long queues of lorries at the port of Dover, right? The day, 2 days before, and then the day after the coming into force of the agreement, January the 1st, and perhaps this was a kind of shock for many, because these things were almost unthinkable, right? However, my feeling is that these frictions will get more and more softened, because it's a matter of time. It's a matter of adaptation. Of course, those red tapes that exporters must fulfill, those customs documentation that need to be filled in, will of course stay, but at the same time, all undertakings will adapt to it, and my expectation is that these frictions, at least the most visual ones, will soften. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think you've got to remember that there's some companies that are used to trading with third countries. Third countries means outside the EU, and so they're used to filling in this paperwork. But there's companies that have never traded with a counterpart outside of the EU, and so for many companies, all this paperwork is quite new. And like you say, Joanne, I think once businesses kind of get used to it and they know exactly what rules of origin say apply to their goods, or they know exactly how to fill in a transit document form, which boxes to tick, etc. That will mean that fewer goods kind of get held up at the border. I mean, we're still seeing the first few weeks of the year was pretty light in terms of trade because of the stockpiling in December. Like you said, some businesses decided to send their goods in December just to make sure there weren't any teething problems to get caught up with any teething problems in January. And so the flows were quite light in the first few weeks. It's now good to see that it's now picked up a lot, and we're now pretty much back to the trade levels of where we were before. And I think most companies have adapted really well. There's still now and again you get a customs declaration that isn't filled in properly, which can create a little bit of a hold up. But I agree with you that over time that should decrease.
Which is actually good news, because it means that on both sides, in the UK and the European Union, exporters will need international trade experts as our students are. So because sometimes go ahead.
I was just saying that in the government, so here in the Department for International Trade, and also colleagues in London, we're very busy speaking to businesses and advising them on the new processes, what the new rules they have to comply with. We do also advise companies to speak to customs agents to speak to, haulier companies, because the people who move these goods, the freight forwarders, these people are real experts on customs processes, so they can help companies a lot. But we're also working really hard to make sure that the new rules are as clear as possible, so businesses can adapt.
I can imagine that you have been experiencing tough times in the recent years. Paul, you mentioned, quite at the beginning of our session, you mentioned that those negotiations, at least the second part or the second phase of the negotiations, were really tough. They took almost 300 days, and yeah. my impression is that they were a lot of personal and institutional efforts to make it in time.
Yeah.
And you, if I'm not wrong, you mentioned 450 UK officials exclusively working on the negotiations. I guess that over the half of them were negotiating on the rules of origin, which are usually the hardest part of the most technical part of the agreement. Just kidding. But could you please try to depict a little bit what were the hardest points of those negotiations? What were the red lines and the easiest and the hardest points
sure.
to negotiate?
Sure. Well, before that, just a kind of clarification point for extra context is that the 450 people were actually negotiating, doing negotiating. If you counted the people who worked on, say, for me, for example, who I wasn't involved in the negotiating, it was between the European Commission and the UK. But people who, one way or another, was involved in Brexit around the negotiations was something in the region of 10,000 people. To give you an indication of kind of the body of work around the negotiations too. And both negotiations, the withdrawal agreement and the future partnership negotiations which ended in the TCA, both were really tough. On the second one, the point on the TCA, the points that I would stress, which is kind of, there's a lot of commentary about these in the press. This was kind of no secret about what the negotiation was hinging on. One is what's known as the level playing field. So I mentioned before about the UK UK leaving the EU and no longer following EU rules, and so there was a big area called the level playing field question, which is how to ensure that the UK, if it's not aligning with EU rules, doesn't undercut EU businesses. So, for example, it works both ways as well. The UK would have legitimate concerns as well around whether the EU could do the same to the UK. So these are to kind of make it a bit more concrete. So things like environmental standards, things like labour standards, things like taxation, things like subsidies for businesses. So the government, what kind of subsidies can a government offer to companies? And it was difficult to find a place where there was rules around these things, but that both sides were still free to regulate, but at the same time not in a way that undermined each other's markets, and if they did, a mechanism to rebalance the agreement. So let me how exactly that agreement was reached, and it's I think it's known as a rebalancing mechanism. And so what it says in the end is that the UK, for example, can introduce a modern subsidy regime which is one thing that the government would potentially could be interested in. But there are rules about what it can do, and if one side feels the other side has actually taken policy measures either on taxation or subsidies or whatever that undermine the level playing field, then if the other side has taken these measures, then this side can introduce retaliatory tariffs to say, okay, if you've subsidized this industry in a way that actually undercuts the single market, we can introduce tariffs on that. And so a lot of the negotiation was around this exact mechanism what mechanism is fair for rebalancing this, and so that was huge, and that came to a good conclusion, and that kind of allowed the negotiation to move forward. This was all happening in the last couple of weeks of the negotiation, and then the very last thing to be agreed was fisheries.
Of course.
Now, fishing was a huge part of the negotiations, and it's important because it's, even though the size of the sector is quite small, if you looked at the kind of millions or billions of pounds that are involved in the industry, it's very small in aggregate compared to bigger industries like, I don't know, automotive or chemicals or agriculture. But actually, it's extremely important. It's a really important sector because there's certain communities that depend wholly on it. So, if you go to certain towns in the UK or in there's probably some not far from Barcelona too, where people's livelihoods depend on it. And so that was a really important part of the negotiations. That went down to the very last day, and the agreement there was that the UK, sorry, just to kind of step back, the situation previously was that the UK was part of the EU common fisheries policy, which kind of governed how much fish the UK was allowed to catch from EU waters and the EU from UK waters, based on an old mechanism known as relative stability from the 1970s. And the situation was that the EU was catching roughly 6 times more fish from UK waters than the UK was catching from EU waters. And so the UK had a clear negotiating position that this had to be kind of changed. Now, the UK was going to be an independent coastal state and would be able to decide on who fishes from the UK waters. And the agreement there came down to numbers where, apparently, I read this in the press. I don't know this firsthand, but according to the Financial Times, at the very last day, it was Boris Johnson negotiating with the Commission President von der Leyen, and Boris Johnson was saying within 5 years, the EU's quota from the UK waters has to come down by 28%. And she said 22%, and in the end we settled on 25%. And so the situation is that the EU quota from UK waters goes down by 25% over the next 5 years, at which point, after 5 years, we will negotiate fish on an annual basis. And so it's kind of a transition period for 5 years for fisheries. So that was the level playing field 1, fisheries 2. And then the third thing, which was important, was around, and difficult, probably not as difficult as the other two, but difficult, was around governance and how we actually police the deal. Where the UK was adamant that the European Court of Justice shouldn't have ultimate control over the laws in the UK. And so we had to find a system where an alternative system, which was a fairer referee, if you like, of the deal. And the way that works is there's a partnership council where we try and resolve disagreements diplomatically if there's any problems with the deal or how it's being implemented. And if that doesn't work, then there's a system for disputes where an independent arbitration panel will decide on who was right or wrong. And so both sides agreed that this was a fair way of policing the agreement. And so that was agreed. Out of the 3 things, I think that might have been the one. Like I said, I wasn't inside the negotiations, but from what I've read, I think that might have been the first one, with then the level playing field, and then finally fish being the last thing to be resolved. Those 3 were probably the 3 single biggest issues.
Yeah, I read, I don't remember where, but I read that these arbitrary courts, which will only be called in case that the diplomatic approaches are not successful, will the chief of this court, the chief arbiter, needs to be neither British nor European. So it seems that it's not going to be I mean, there are plenty of potential candidates, but it's not going to be easy to find suitable people able to cope and deal with these arbitration courts, right?
Yeah.
We'll see. Hopefully, this is not. This is only a measure that stays black on white and never is implemented because the diplomatic efforts are sufficient.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, but it's you see it quite a lot in international trade where there are disputes do inevitably arise at some point, and the important thing is having a fair, a fair mechanism for dealing with them when they do arise. Like you say, hopefully there'll be there won't be too many.
And back to your points, I like you mentioned fisheries as one of the hardest troubles, or one of the hardest points to negotiate, and which came at the very last moment. And because I have the perception that continental Europe, or in many cases in Europe, we did not even understand why fisheries was just popping up at the very last minute out of the blue. And I like this idea that specific communities. I mean, I'd like to highlight this idea that the specific communities are fully dependent on this sector, and perhaps it's not a relevant sector in the ensemble, but it's very, very important for these communities, and this obliges us to think of the consequences of trade agreements, because we generally think of the widest level, but then this has impact on lower levels, and this is the literature refers to the losers of globalization and the losers of free trade agreements, right? And perhaps this is a good example of how specific communities may lobby and may organize themselves to make their claims heard independently if we as Europeans understand these specific positions. But happy that I was happy that you mentioned this this issue. Thank you. What else? Sorry for that. I'm firing you with a lot of questions, but
no, that's fine. Keep them coming.
I mean, we have such a great opportunity to discuss these issues with you that before leaving the floor to the audience, I want to cover two last questions. First of all, Paul, what about the implementation? Because we have talked a lot about the negotiations, and we have focused on the past. We should focus now on the present and the future trade and economic relationships, right? And the implementation scares many people because of these images of lorries. We have already commented that hopefully actually they are no longer there. These poor drivers had to spend the New Year's Eve on the road, but that was a pity, of course. But my expectation is this will not happen again. But what are your expectations about the implementation of this deal? How will both administrations, both governments, if I may, deal with it, and what are your expectations?
Yeah, well, around the year the situation was difficult because of COVID too, and so it was only the last week of the year where there was a new requirement introduced for drivers of goods, so the lorry drivers, to actually have a COVID test before leaving the UK to go into France, and it was that rather than the end of the Brexit transition period, it was the COVID tests which actually caused most of the story about lorry drivers being stuck in Dover and not being able to get back for Christmas or New Year, which is quite sad in some cases. In terms of the implementation of the deal, one thing which I don't think I've said it in these terms yet, which is quite important, but this isn't a deal that's done, signed, that's it now, that's it forever. It's a framework for future cooperation. And so the hard work and the negotiation was done, but there's still plenty of work to be done in working through the implementation of this. To give you kind of a few examples. Firstly, there's plenty of the deal that hasn't actually, or plenty of the new rules for that arise from the UK being a third country, no longer in the EU. Plenty of rules that haven't actually come into force yet. So the EU introduced most rules from the 1st of January, but on the UK side, so for goods going from the EU to the UK, they won't actually have to comply with new rules in some cases until, say, for example, for paying tariffs, if there are any, because of rules of origin. If there are any, they won't have to actually pay until the end of June. Same for VAT. For the products of animal or plant origin that need the SPS checks that I mentioned before, for most goods, those checks won't have to be carried out until April. So the UK government has taken a phased approach to introducing these new controls to give businesses more time to adapt. And that will happen throughout this year. In some products, the new rules won't actually come in properly until for a couple of years. One of the things when I mentioned before we started about possibly sharing my screen is because there's a really interesting diagram that shows all the new rules that are going to come in from now for the next few years, and it's full. You can see that it'll be a certain chemical regulation that suddenly applies in a few months, or certain conformity standards, and the quality mark on a product is suddenly is no longer accepted from I don't know, a certain date in the future, and so what I'll do is after this, when I finish speaking, I'll put in the chat a link to this, just to give. It's interesting for you to see that this isn't kind of everything's been done, but actually implementation is gonna happen from now going forward. I mean, and there's a few other things that both sides need to work on. So, for example, around movement of people, there's a big issue around recognition of professional qualifications. And so, if somebody's a trained accountant, can they go and practice accountancy in the other country? And on some professions, this requires bilateral, so not UK and EU, but rather UK and a member state to come to an arrangement. And so the deal provides for that kind of agreement to happen in the future, but it doesn't the deal doesn't say exactly how it's going to work. So it's up to the member states and the UK to actually discuss that and come to agreements. Another thing on financial services, for example, where on financial services there is a lot of the access, so whether you can sell financial services to the other side, depends on whether the other side has made what's known as an equivalence decision to say that your regulations are pretty much equal, and therefore your services are okay to be sold. And those kind of processes around equivalence and a regulator looking at the other side and saying, okay, yeah, is it equivalent? Okay, it is. Therefore, we can sell things into their market. Those kind of processes are separate to this agreement. They'll happen independently over time. Really important for financial services. Really important for data and the transfer of personal data. This is a huge issue where a 6-month transition period has been created whilst both sides look at what's known as data adequacy to decide whether the other side is standards for protecting personal data are adequate to allow the flow of personal data. The UK is still waiting for the EU's decision on that. Again, another really important area outside of the agreement. So there's lots of important areas where we need to keep cooperating and talking and cooperating to make sure that the level of market access that we have now improves as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. So interesting, Paul. So interesting. I have it here. You actually mentioned, and this is my very last question, promise. You mentioned that and this is a term that I wrote down because I like it very much. You mentioned that the UK-EU trade and cooperation agreement is a best in class.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. I agree. Even though we need to accept that there were some constraints, some red lines from both negotiating teams that perhaps, if they could have not existed, the agreement could have been even more comprehensive, even more positive for both sides. But in general terms, I agree. That's a best-in-class agreement. Back in December, the UK announced that the UK and Japan had came into an agreement, have negotiated and successfully concluded a very comprehensive economic and trade agreement with Japan. And at the same time, Japan announced that his positive views on support, on the possibility that the UK could eventually join the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a free trade agreement which joins together many Pacific nations, Japan and South Korea on the one side, Canada and Mexico on the other. The UK now needs to rebuild, if I may, this network of trade and economic partnerships around the globe. Because since January the 1st this year, the UK can no longer enjoy the common trade policy, the EU common trade policy. How do you see this process? Of course, there are big and small fishes on the pond. Of course, the transatlantic relations with Canada and the US have been always important for London, for the UK. How do you see this process of creating this network of trade relations?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's something that is a priority for the UK. It's not, the fact that in fact, it was one of the reasons for voting to leave the EU. Some people have a misconception that Brexit was actually protectionist, and I can see the logic to some extent, because we're leaving a single market, the biggest trading block in the world, and to leave that people might think it's protectionist. But actually, if you look back at even the manifestos of so vote leave, for example, people like Nigel Farage, free trade was actually one of the reasons why people they were talked about as a reason why people wanted to leave the EU. And the logic was that once outside the EU, the UK has control of its own free trade, its own trade policy, and it can strike deals with the rest of the world. Obviously, the EU has a lot of negotiating power because it's such a big bloc. But at the same time, it can mean that it's less agile, because you have to please 27 member states, and some obviously sometimes have a sector which they don't want to liberalize, etc. Whereas now the UK is free to strike trade deals with the rest of the world, and so it is in that respect, it is a big opportunity for the UK. You mentioned TPP, and only a few days ago the UK announced that we are applying to join that. As you say, there's I think it's 11 countries, Asia Pacific, and it's really that's going to be a really important step. I think you mentioned transatlantic, and the UK is also negotiating with the US. So there's plenty. There's plenty of areas, and I think you said the word yourself, a network. That is what the UK wants. The UK wants to be. The UK is always has been, always will be a strong believer in free trade. We've all done the economics classes that show you that there's a clear benefit from free trade for businesses, consumers, choice, productivity, etc., etc. And the UK wants to be at the centre of a network of free trade agreements with the whole world. And it's going to be a big negotiating effort over the coming years, but that is where we want to end up, and not actually only in terms of the agreements that we strike, but as a champion of free trade in international fora as well. So, for example, you know, this year the UK has presidency of the G7, the group of the big 7 economies. We also are on the G20. This year, also the UK has the presidency for the COP26 climate summit, which is a huge thing in our fight against climate change. And so the UK wants to be, as well as kind of the deals we're striking with countries, the UK wants to be a voice of liberalism on free trade, to promote free trade and cooperation around the world as the best way of meeting challenges around things like climate change, or, you know, the recovery from COVID, where we're currently in a, you know, difficult economic situation, and free trade is the way to actually support the economic recovery.
Yes, I fully agree. I was thinking on this. I think it's the last or the second to the last EU Common Trade Policy Strategy, which was entitled Trade for All, which basically redounded on those ideas, on the good of and the benefits of free trade, and the attachment of the EU on the multilateral setting, which is something that I guess the UK will join with no doubt. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for clarifying us all these issues. I think it's time now for opening the floor to our audience, to the students enrolled in this course and other students that happily joined the session. So again, remember, people, that either you write down your question in the chat, or you just switch on you raise your hand, you use this icon, raise your hand, and afterward you switch on your mic and speak out loudly. Thank you. Who cast the first stone? Ferdinando.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Hi, Jean-Pierre. And I wanted to ask you something from the political perspective. I wanted to know if Brexit and the post-Brexit scenario will change somehow the let's say the polarization of vote of people. Let's say if they will change from the Conservative Party majority to, I don't know, Liberal Democrats or something else. Does it change the political scenario?
Thanks, Ferdinando, for the question. I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but I'll give you my view on it. I think, to be honest, people want to forget about Brexit now. It's happened. We've now got a free trade agreement with the EU too. I think people want to look forward. You know, the last general election was fought on the issue of Brexit, and Boris Johnson won a majority. So I think, in terms of all the talk of what people voted for and etc. My personal view was actually the whole way through the process, and still is now, that most people in the UK wanted to leave the EU. And if you ask them now, they're happy that we left the EU. And I think there's a lot of commentary kind of questioning that fact. For me, like throughout the whole process, I kind of always thought that people, you know, the result was completely legitimate, and it was clear, and the government had to act on it, which is what they did. And I think if there was any doubt on, this is just kind of my personal opinions here, if there was any doubt on it, I think that was cleared up by the last general election, where, you know, the result in the general election was in line with the referendum, which was that the party that was promoting getting Brexit done actually won a majority. But I think now it's an issue where, you know, there's people I think people were ready to move on from Brexit 3 years ago, let alone now. I think both sides, you know, the Labour Party too, I think people are just want to look forward now. You know, we've got huge issues to deal with, things like COVID and climate change, and I think we've got pressing issues to deal with. So I think that political debate is over, to be honest, my personal opinion.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ferdinando, for daring to cast the first stone and breaking the ice. Thank you. Hope everything is okay. More questions. Let's take advantage of such a wonderful key speaker. Who has any further question to Paul? Okay, Caleb, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I was wondering about the 4 freedoms that are like inherent in the single market. So it's quite a broad question, I know, but on which of these 4 freedoms would you say, with the now Brexit deal, the UK has like to struggle with the most, or in which of these 4 freedoms they had to have the most disadvantages, basically?
You mean which are the most frictions? Where are the most frictions, you mean?
Or like from the Brexit deal now, it should obviously differ from how the single market was. So which of these 4 freedoms was like the one that was affected the most, basically?
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, hard to kind of quantify, to be honest. I think on all 4 it's not the same access as it was before. They don't flow fully frictionlessly, if that's a word, like they did before. I mentioned on goods some of the issues around goods, where, you know, there's 100% tariff liberalization, which is fantastic, but there are certain processes that you have to comply with, which means that it's not fully frictionless like before. Same in services, where I mentioned there's reservations. Each country has reservations, or for example, in financial services, where we don't have the financial services passport like we used to, where a firm in the UK could sell services to anywhere in the EU. But at the same time, it is, like I said before, best in class in services, and there's plenty of provisions to help facilitate that. The one thing just to touch on a bit more is, I would say, movement of people, because it's something that I haven't actually spoke about yet, and it's an important one. So the situation there is that, so previously there was free movement of people. So someone from the UK could move to, say, Barcelona to live, study, work, do nothing, and it was in their kind of right to do so. You know, you might not have got free healthcare unless you paid in a little bit to Social Security, but there was no one stopping you from being here. And that's now changed, where so when at the end of the transition period, at the end of December, the UK left the single market and left free movement of people ended. Now the situation there is that it kind of depends. It gets quite complicated because it depends on what you're traveling for. So and again, like the other things, it's a bit of a balance. There's some it's not the same as it was before, but there's still kind of a lot of provisions to help facilitate movement. So, for example, for tourists, there is that you can go for without a visa to travel to the UK, or for the UK to Spain, and you don't need a visa. You can still go on your holidays as before. You can also go for business reasons. If you're going to, say, take part in a meeting, or if you have a company in Barcelona and you have another office in the UK, you can go and work in that office in the UK. It's known as intra-company transfer. You can do that. But if you want to actually move countries to work and say, start a new job in a new company and for a long time, then you would need a visa, that's a new thing. Now, what the UK has done is the UK has introduced a new immigration system, which is based on on points. So you get points depending on your characteristics. And the general philosophy is that this is not, it doesn't, whether you get a visa to go to the UK doesn't depend on where you're from, but actually what your attributes are. Which, I mean, again, this is a kind of personal opinion, and maybe I'm biased because my wife is Colombian, and so she's had problems, even though, you know, speaks perfect English, has a master's degree, great professional experience, and she would really struggle to get a visa to work in either Spain or the UK just because she comes from a different country. So what the UK is introducing is a system where it doesn't matter where you're from. It's more what you actually can do. And so from now on, regardless of whether you're Spanish or Colombian, if you to get a visa to work in the UK, you have to meet the points-based rules, which are actually not as, or more kind of easier, lower restrictions than the UK's restrictions were for third countries previously. In other words, it's probably easier for a Colombian now to move to the UK than it was before. And likewise for the EU people, it's gone harder because it's no longer free movement. But I hope for people who are listening here, for example, I would kind of make the point that the UK, you know, this immigration system reflects the fact that the UK is a global country trading with the rest of the world. We want to attract the best people from everywhere. In case you were wondering, kind of how does this points thing work? If you speak English and you have a degree, then you've already got almost the number of points necessary. There's a salary. There's points you get for salary, and I think it's something roughly like £25,000 a year. If you have a job offer for £25,000 a year and you speak English and you have a degree, then that's it. You've got a visa. And there's also plenty of other routes for people to take. So, for example, from this summer, there's a graduate scheme, which means that if you study in the UK, then you afterwards get, if you do say a bachelor's degree in the UK or a master's, you can stay for 2 years doing any job without having to comply with the points, because we do want people like you and others who are you know, great students, got lots of potential, to come and move to the UK and work and live in the UK, because it is you know, it is a very, you know, innovative economy. There's some fantastic businesses doing really interesting things, and we want to have the best pool of talent. So that sets out hopefully a bit of the UK immigration policy, which wasn't exactly your question, but I think it is kind of connected to the issues of free movement. And then the final one on capital, movement of capital, where there are important provisions in the TCA on investment to avoid situations of discrimination. In other words, what it makes provisions for, in many cases, you say, for example, in procurement, imagine if a UK company wanted to invest in Barcelona, or the other way around, and it was bidding for a contract, the host authorities wouldn't be able to say, well, you know what, we're not going to give that to this company from Barcelona because we prefer someone from the UK. That's not allowed, and that's something, you know, the UK is we think that the investment, like trade, is good for each of our economies. It's good for competition, and so while capital, like the others, it's not 100% frictionless like before. The TCA does provide for a much better degree of access and higher flows than would have been the case without the agreement.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, I was listening about the free movement of people and labor. I was thinking of an article published in the Economist last week, which talk about this perfect storm due to the Brexit plus the COVID plus the huge housing prices in London and in the city, which seems to have enabled to have pushed many non-UK workers to leave the city and settle down back in their home countries, right? Both for blue collars and white collars, especially for blue collars. Don't you think that this is one of the tricky parts of leaving the single market? Of course, the UK it wants to be, because it is already a pool of attraction for high skilled workers, international trade experts included. But at the same time, in this transition period, in this uncertain times due to the COVID, due to the economic recession, don't you think that the British labor market may suffer from a brain drain? But I mean, it was that follows a brain gain that enjoyed because of being part of the single market.
Yeah,
I put just to give you a couple of examples in my own sector. I have plenty of colleagues, continental Europeans that are, assistant professors with full-time positions in many British universities that are at least considering the possibility to find a position abroad. How do you see this? Because this is a risk. This is a risk for the UK labor market and for the UK companies. This loss of human capacities.
Yeah. Well, I think before answering that question, just to flag, because the last question I went on for a long time about UK immigration policy, and just to make it clear that obviously it works both ways, that there's the same restrictions apply now for British people moving to the EU. This isn't kind of a, just the UK has taken this decision. Your question, there's quite a few. I mean, there's a few different components there, and the point about people moving out of the central London, where property prices are really high, and going to the outskirts. I mean, that's a fascinating kind of sociological, cultural question of how the COVID lockdown is going to affect us and how we want to live our lives in the future, which I'm not very qualified to answer. Although I will note that I did my dissertation at Pompeu. I did my dissertation on the UK housing market and trying to analyse whether there was a bubble or not. And I know since then prices are probably still a lot higher than they were back then, which was only 8 years ago. I would say, I think there's a couple of reasons why I think the UK is always going to have a strong labour market. One is, first of all, the flexibility of the labour market. We have a very we have a labour market where the employees have a lot of power. If you're a young professional, and hopefully some of the students on this call will be looking for jobs, and if you look at a job site in the UK, the number of jobs available is just unbelievable. It's unbelievable, and fantastic jobs. And employers know that if you don't like your job, you'll find something better. And so employers are kind of put time and money into investing in you and giving you training. And the unemployment rate is so low. I'm not sure what it is off the top of my head now with COVID, but pre-COVID it was 3.9%. It's almost full employment. And that all comes down to culture and labour market regulations. That kind of thing isn't gonna change. That makes it a good place. You mentioned the universities, and the UK is a leading country for education and science. We have the last rankings I saw, 4 of the top 10 universities in the world in the UK, and so I think the quality of the institutions will always attract people. Also, when it comes to business, it's not, you know, there's a whole ecosystem in the UK around say things like science and professional services, where you know, if you work in one business but you look for you might need an accountant or a lawyer who is also, you know, you also have high quality people providing the services that you're looking for. There's a whole ecosystem there in not just in London, but actually there's other places, say in, I don't know, Leeds, in the north of England where I'm from. There's plenty of areas which are great hubs for business and professional services and science and academia. And so I think that the UK offer is still really strong. And actually, because of although I agree that there's no longer free movement of people, and so it is slightly harder than it was before for people from the EU. It's still, for, you know, like I said, the visa requirements are not insurmountable, far from it, and I would still hope that we will continue to, the UK will still continue to attract the best and some great people from the EU. And not only that, but now the fact that we've got this an immigration system more balanced to the whole world means that there'll be from I don't know, the US or India or from wherever, from the whole world. The UK is going to be a global economy, a global business environment with people from all over, which I know is, again, this goes to the misconception of what Brexit is about. You know, the future of the UK is completely the opposite of protectionist and inward looking. We want the UK to be the center of, you know, the global connections, both in terms of people and business and commerce.
Yeah, thank you, because it's great to contrast these images that we may get from domestic media or continental media, right? I have another question by Mark, who says, London is one of the main financial markets of the world. Do you think, Paul, that as lots of economists say, the city will lose this privileged status?
So I think my answer would be no. I don't think so. I think, and partly it's for the reasons that I was just explaining in terms of people, and I touched upon this idea of the ecosystem. The financial services are so huge in the UK, especially in the city in London, that's not easy to replicate. That's something that's built up over not even years and decades, but actually centuries. And you know, the fact that the pools of finance are so deep, the fact that the networks of contacts are so extensive, it means that it's still a great place to raise finance. Even if you're an EU business and you're looking for, say, you're a startup and you're looking for investment, the UK is a great place to get it, because it's you know, there's so many investors and you know, looking for the right product. And I think that's going to be, I don't think that's going to be easy to replace. And the other thing is, even in terms of market access, you know, there's our relationship on financial services is going to evolve over time. You know, in the TCA, there's a point about regulatory cooperation, and how in March we're going to publish a memorandum of understanding to put into text what this regulatory cooperation actually means. But that's really positive. There's the equivalence decisions to improve market access as well, that hopefully will happen over time. The UK also has now freedom to regulate, and so the Treasury, where I used to work in financial services in the Treasury, I'm sure they will also be looking at future regulation and how to regulate in a way that secures the status of the UK as a global financial centre. So I'd be optimistic of the UK in financial services. I think our offer in financial services is excellent, and I think and I hope long may that continue, and I think it will.
Good. Thank you, Paul. If you have still time for them, we have at least two further questions. One in written, one by Christina that raised her hand. Christina, the floor is entirely yours.
Yeah, actually, so I'm doing an internship currently in a company of wallpaper, and we do like we trade with the UK, and actually it's something I'm wondering, but because we have noticed there are a lot of issues in customs, and there are a lot of packages we have already sent, and there's a lot of retention. But also it's not like for the UK direct packages, but sometimes there's this particular one which has been retained, I think 3 weeks now from Taiwan, but since they share the same customs, I don't know why this package from Taiwan is being retained also. So we have noticed that there's a lot of retention and customs are overloaded due to the Brexit situation, and I'm wondering what's the point, because from here we have noticed there's a lot of concerns for this particular big company that is a distributor in the UK there. So I don't know what's the feeling in the UK currently, and for many businesses who do this kind of trades and distributes, because from our perspective, from the company and from here, it's been a very quite mess. But because the whole customs, it's overload, and also you can call it and you will be waiting, and there's no really a quick response, and there's not even a prediction, because like today, for example, I have been calling to them and they cannot even give me a time when the proper administrator or whoever has to read and check, because there has been some paperwork it's been required, but and we have already sent it 3 times, and I don't know like how this situation is being shown in the
You've given me a classic business inquiry. So this is a lot of my job since the 1st of January has been trying to smooth out some of the problems that some companies, as you say, are facing. Because, you know, like I said, I think the vast majority are flowing fine, but because these systems are new, sometimes it's taking a little bit of time to get used to. Now, the particular case you mentioned, I think you mentioned Taiwan. Did you say it's something going from Taiwan? I mean, there's issues around VAT. There's new VAT rules that have come in on the 1st of January that actually are not to do with Brexit, but are new rules that mean that online marketplaces now have to account for the VAT and send it to HMRC, which also kind of makes things a little bit more complicated in terms of with the rest of the world. I think it's a good policy, and I think it'll kind of I think it's going to be a fairer way of working VAT, but it means that certain sellers, it's an extra thing that sellers have to get used to, basically, as well as Brexit. I mean, in terms of what we do at DIT, and it's something that afterwards I can kind of give you. It sounds like you've already got a number to call, but I can give you, if you tell me afterwards kind of the exact problem that's holding it up, I can try and give you advice on how you might be able to overcome it, or which department you can speak to about it. This is kind of a common part of my week at the moment, where a company comes in and says that there's an issue with something being held up, and we find ways to explain it. So let's speak separately.
Then, yeah, you speak separately. I was about to say that. If you don't mind, I'll put you in contact. Thank you, Christina, for your question, because it brings us back to, I mean, it obliges us to have the feet on the floor, right? We have been thinking on very general issues, because I am a political scientist, and perhaps because I am unconsciously driving the talk with Paul in that direction. But then there are pragmatic and specific issues that matter a lot. Thank you, Christina, for your question, and thank you, Paul, for your availability. Back to our chat, we have a question again. We move from the more technical and more pragmatic to the more general. Paul, Marina asks, what do you think, Paul, is going to happen in Scotland Is it possible that due to the changing conditions, since they voted massively to remain in the EU, there will be another referendum?
So yeah, as you say, so Scotland was one of the parts of the UK that more people voted to remain than to leave. I mean, it wasn't completely astronomical either. It was, I think it was 60-40. Like London, where I think in London more people voted to remain than to leave, maybe even within a higher percentage than in Scotland. Northern Ireland, where I'm from a town called Southport in the northwest, and in Southport there, more people voted to remain than to leave, which was quite unusual for the north of England. But there's plenty of parts in the UK where the referendum result was more in favour of remain than to leave. But the referendum was conducted on by the whole country for the whole country, and the result was as you know, leave, and so that applies to the whole of the UK, and that's what the government has taken forward in consultation with the devolved administrations and the governments from around the UK along the way. But the leaving the EU was something for the whole of the UK. And in terms of the Scotland independence movement, there was a referendum in 2015, I think it was, where people voted to remain part of the UK. And this is obviously a political question, and kind of not, so it's not kind of for me to say. But I think if you're asking Boris Johnson the question, he'd probably he would probably say, there has been a referendum in 2015, and that is kind of that settles it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. That's the for the better and for the worse, the referendums cannot be run constantly, right? This is something which our parliamentary democracies need to consider. But again, of course,
I mean, the other thing, just to chip in, another thing, it wasn't, there was issues going back here to the Scotland referendum in 2015. There was issues around. It wasn't all obviously about the EU. There was issues around the pound, say, and the currency, which would also be valid now. So personal opinion, I'm not sure that the fact that the UK's left the EU suddenly kind of changes everything. But I think the main point is that there has been a referendum, and so I don't know. I think, like I said, it's a political question, but I think the UK government would probably say there already has been a referendum, and that settles the matter.
Yeah, definitely. This is obviously a topic for political opinion, not for. I mean, and unfortunately, we have no crystal ball to see what will happen. Okay, it's 2:25. I guess we still enjoy of Paul's patience for the very last question, if any.
As long as it's an easy one.
It's entirely up to them. So if you still have something in mind you want to contrast, to share, to consider with Paul, this is now your time. Okay, Mark, go ahead. The floor is entirely yours.
Hi. I think that, well, a good point from this agreement is that there is free trade between the UK and the UK. I mean, between the UK and between the EU. But I think that, as you have said, if there is some products that are imported from third countries like China, Vietnam, or whatever, then when they have to come to the EU, they will have to pay some sort of tariffs. But I think that this will be more difficult than that, because we live in a globalized world, and we don't ship only products. It's going to be like parts of the products, and maybe you are going to build a smartphone or whatever with a piece that is built in Vietnam and another one in China and another one in Canada and another one. So, okay, there is free trade between the UK or the EU, but I think that this will remove some sort of competitive advantage to the UK, because how will you manage to define what's going to be the tariffs and all the documentation of all of this? It's going to be more effort on this.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. So yeah, this is the rules of origin issue that we discussed earlier. I mean, this is what a lot of the negotiations around rules of origin were there to do, to establish exactly, what percentage of components are allowed to come from a third country and still be able to get tariff-free access. Obviously, even if you don't qualify for tariff-free access, you can still trade the product. But it would mean, as you say, having to pay a tariff on it. I think in most cases, hopefully the rules of origin requirements are sufficiently liberal that companies, maybe if they might in some cases have to tweak their supply chains a little bit, or look at their suppliers. But I think hopefully in many cases it doesn't require too much of a problem for businesses to be able to comply with rules of origin and get that preferential access if they need it. I mean, another thing just to make clear is that the rules of origin chapter, or the part of the agreement, does allow businesses to what's known as cumulate. So it means that EU components can be used in the UK production and sold to the EU. And that qualifies for tariff-free, if you see what I mean. So like, if a UK exporter can use EU components and the EU can use UK components, and between the two, it's absolutely fine. The issue is more, like you mentioned there, exactly, when the imports come from third countries, and there it becomes something that companies have to look at, and rules of origin. And yeah, they can be quite complicated. Hopefully, as time goes on and companies get to know get to kind of fully understand what rules apply, if necessary, they can look at tweaking supply chains if necessary. But I hope for the vast majority of trade, that's not a problem.
Yeah, the complicated world of rules of origin, Paul. The complicated world of rules of origin. Thank you very much. I guess that we can leave it there, unless there is a very, very last question, because we don't want to abuse of your time. It's 2:30, so lunchtime, at least in Spain. Paul, we thank you a lot. We thank you very, very much for joining us today. We thank you for your time and for your very, very clear insights on this complicated issue of the Brexit. We hope you enjoyed the session too, as much as we did, and we welcome you again.
I've just put in the chat the link to the agreement, because even like I said, it's 1,246 pages and it'll bore you to death. But just to see something actually on paper, and so you don't think it's this mystical thing. So actually, you can actually see it written down. It's quite interesting, just to see kind of how it's structured on paper. I'll also put in the chat, if I can find it, it's from the Institute for Government, a UK think tank, on all the steps that happen from now forward. So you can see that it's not fully been implemented yet, and it's a process going forward.
Excellent. Relevant information. Thank you very much, Paul. Okay.
And finally, just one more thing, just to say thanks to everyone for joining and for the really interesting questions. It's been great, and hopefully I'll be able to repeat it at some point in the future, maybe even in person, who knows.
Maybe in person, who knows. Okay, Paul, thank you very much, and we'll stay in touch.
Okay, thank you, all the best.